Chapter 24, Sustaining Aquatic Biodiversity. In Chapter 7, we focused on the levels of aquatic biodiversity. This chapter focuses on how we can preserve it as well as how we can impact it in the first place. The aquatic regions with the highest levels of biodiversity are coral reefs, estuaries, and the deep ocean floor. Biodiversity is generally higher near coastal areas because they combine the benefits of the eutrophic and abyssal zones. There are high nutrient, oxygen, temperature, and sunlight penetration levels that allow for a large abundance of producers. Remember, producers determine how biodiverse a food web is. More producers will lead to higher rates of biodiversity. The lowest levels of biodiversity are found in the bathyal zone because there are few nutrients, the dissolved oxygen level is low, and light doesn't penetrate very well for the photosynthesizers or warmth purposes. The three biggest ways in which we affect aquatic biodiversity are overfishing, habitat destruction and degradation, as well as pollution. Because of this, as a whole, the aquatic life zones on our planet are currently more at risk than the terrestrial biomes. Over 50% of the world's original wetlands have disappeared due to coastal development and pollution. Almost 60% of the world's coral reefs are at risk or endangered due to warming waters and lowering pH levels in the ocean. 40% of the world's mangroves have been filled in for agriculture or damaged by coastal development. Bottom-dwelling habitats have been destroyed by fishing techniques such as dredging and trawling. Overall, we have drastically depleted aquatic life zones by just everyday things that people don't think twice about. Coastal property is highly sought after, and we have a growing population that needs to be fed. As a result, our aquatic life zones have been placed on the back burner. We are seeing the same trends in freshwater habitats that we see in marine habitats. Over half of the inland wetlands in the U.S. have disappeared due to coastal development and pollution. 60% of the world's largest rivers have been diverted or dammed, causing a drop in the flow rate downstream from these diversions, and eventually a drastic impact on the ecosystem in these locations. Currently, we are overfishing in our marine systems because of the unsustainable fishing techniques we practice. For more information on this, watch the fishing techniques and their effects on aquatic sustainability video on my channel. 200 commercially fished fish species are either in danger of or are being overfished to the limit. Once this occurs, the species is considered commercially extinct. This has a greatly negative impact on aquatic ecosystems. The introduction of non-native species, whether intentional or not, is causing a massively negative impact on aquatic ecosystems. Remember, non-native species generally don't have any natural predators or any other organisms that act as competitors for resources. As a result, they have a tendency to overtake the pre-existing organisms and can in turn break down an entire food web. The last way in which we are impacting our aquatic ecosystems is through pollution and global warming. One thing humans tend to forget is that any chemicals that are sprayed on agricultural areas or in even just our yards don't stay in these locations. Whenever there is a rain event, these chemicals run off into our waterways. When a pollutant is in water, all of the organisms that live in that body of water are affected by it. The biggest forms of pollution we allow into aquatic systems are oil, acid, plant nutrients, toxic chemicals, and sediment. Global warming is caused by the increase of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This warms the water as well as increases the amount of carbon dioxide that diffuses into the ocean. Both of these acts decrease biodiversity by exceeding the range of tolerance for temperature and pH ranges of aquatic organisms. Based off of what we have learned from how we have such a negative impact on aquatic ecosystems, you would think that we would place a much larger emphasis on aquatic ecosystem protection, but that isn't always easy. People have a tendency to see the ocean as an infinite resource on which humans can't have much but a little effect on. Most of the damage that has occurred to these ecosystems is not in a location that is easily accessible or regularly accessed by the general public. Because of this, most people assume a not-in-my-backyard mentality for preventative measures. Lastly, most of the ocean is outside of the legal reaches of all countries and is not owned by one entity. As a result, even if many countries come together to create a treaty or a set of bylaws to help preserve aquatic organisms, no nation can enforce it regularly. The best means of protecting not just aquatic systems but any system on Earth is to approach it with preventative measures. It is much easier to prevent something than to clean it up. This is looking at it both ecologically and economically. The lower down in a food web you plan to protect, the better off your ecosystem as a whole will be. Remember, It is not just enough to protect individual species. You have to protect their habitats in order to ensure successful population growth in endangered and vulnerable species. This can be implemented by the creation of MPAs, or marine protected areas. These areas not only protect the species that live in them, but the environments in which they live as well. Another way in which we help prevent aquatic ecosystem depletion is by implementing coastal management. This helps determine what kind of activity or development can occur in certain coastal regions. If a plot of land is close to an estuary, then generally coastal management will not allow for coastal development. This would decrease the amount of runoff pollution that ends up in the waterway. Wetlands act as a natural filtration system for fresh water flowing into marine areas. By allowing wetlands to naturally replenish polluted waters, we can save large sums of money as well as the aquatic ecosystems in which these polluted waters would naturally flow. Currently, most of the efforts to counteract our impact on aquatic ecosystems are mitigation banking based. These methods allow consumers to use wetlands how they please as long as other equivalent sized land is being replenished or turned into wetlands. There are downsides to this. Man-made wetlands don't perform as well filtration-wise as natural wetlands. The Everglades are a perfect example of how we can help natural wetlands replenish themselves. Currently, we have agricultural areas that are upstream of the Everglades. This would typically sound like a no-no, but because any chemicals that end up in the river or stream will flow downstream into the Everglades. Currently, we have plans in place that restrict agriculture and chemical use of the land for many miles upstream from the Everglades to allow for the wetlands to naturally filtrate the water or dilute the pollutants to such low levels that the agricultural activity has little to no effect on the Everglades. In lakes, the biggest thing to consider in our impact is the fact that anything that runs off into these areas will not leave. Lakes and ponds are stagnant areas of water that do not flow or allow for the filtration of chemicals as a result. Runoff pollution is the biggest impact we have on lakes, followed closely by the introduction of invasive species. The prime example of non-native species introduced into a lake system with huge detrimental effects is the zebra mussel. As for rivers and other forms of flowing fresh water, the biggest concern with human impact is diversion and damming. Both of these techniques impact organisms that rely on higher flow rates for survival and reproduction. Hydroelectric power is considered to be a positive thing in the fact that both the flowing water is cheap and can be considered an inexhaustible resource if not overused. The problem is that it is overused in many rivers and can result in the destruction of aquatic ecosystems downstream from the dam.